Hello everyone, this video is of course part of a series that is fundraising for Ukrainian refugees. Thank you guys so much to all of you who have already donated. It really makes a difference. Even a small amount means a small amount of action over there, and a small amount of action can make a difference to someone desperately in need. So thank you so very much. Right, so we've talked about the Kriosians quite a lot, but I think it's only fair that we give the devil his dues and talk about their adversary, the Klingon Empire. So, the first thing to really talk about is the context of the Klingon Empire in the 22nd century. It's not the major power that it will later become. It's more of a localized regional power that's really just fighting for its place amidst a quadrant that is filled with very old and very prestigious, influential nations, including the Rigelians, the Malurians, the Orions, the Kriosians, all of whom were involved in the Pax Orionis system of alliance. And this is quite a powerful block now. The Klingons don't really like Pax Orionis. They're kind of going to be in a mood to change it, because the Klingons aren't really about trade. So their goal is going to be to destroy Pax Orionis. Because the Klingons are quite a minor power for a lot of this period, they're an underdog, and they don't have the economics or the technology to really match a lot of their neighbours on a peer-to-peer level. Most fleets of this period operate reasonably large-sized ships and operate what I've described previously as deadlock warfare, where shields are very, very effective at stopping projectile weapons, such as nuclear warheads, railguns, things like that, and ships' armour systems are very good at absorbing hits from energy weapons, basic particle cannons or lasers, stuff like that. The result of this is that basically warfare is raising and lowering shields, and it's a big slugging match between large, powerful warships. Now, the Klingons cannot really compete with that. They do not have the resources to build ships that could actually take these ships on and beat them at their own game. So they decide to break the game. The Klingons' approach to warfare is far more violent and aggressive, and the Klingons place far more emphasis on their offensive capabilities. First and foremost, really it goes firepower, speed, and then defences. That's really their list of priorities. And so they create ships that aren't perhaps the most survivable, but they have the ability, through one of their two innovations, that being disruptors and photon torpedoes, they have the ability to inflict damage on ships that are far larger than themselves. By the 22nd century, both photon torpedoes and disruptors are in use, and both of these are very effective at breaking deadlock warfare. Disruptors can do just as much damage to a hull as they can shields, and photon torpedoes are still very effective against shields as they are with direct hits on the hull. So this is how the Klingons break deadlock warfare, is to create a new class of weapons that are effective on both categories, to some and lesser extent. There's still differences. Disruptors are still slightly better on shields, and torpedoes are still slightly better on the hull. Anyway, that's what kind of is dictating Klingon doctrine in this period. So actually one of the things you get is very specialised ships. You'll get gunships and torpedo ships, and they're very separate categories in terms of their roles and their tasks. The other thing to mention is that the Empire is of course very decentralized in this period. Rule is spread out across the various different great houses, and this accounts for why there's a lot of variety in different ship classes and a lot of overlap, because each house is getting ships built for their specific needs. And so that's why there's a lot of variety in the Klingon fleet of this particular period. So, without any further ado, we'll get into each individual ship class, going from smallest to heaviest. So the first ship we'll talk about is the Raider. Now the Raider appears in the Augment arc of Enterprise. It only appears once. It's a very, very small agile ship. It's about 70 meters long. It's very, very small. There's really not much to say about it. It has 2 disruptor cannons on the wings and a torpedo launcher, and I'm quite sure that that is a torpedo launcher because the aperture there is big enough to be a torpedo launcher. It might not have much in the way of ammunition, and certainly its preference is going to be to engage with its disruptors. It's very much going to be a wolfpack ship. It's quite weak individually, but it's very agile and in numbers can probably overwhelm larger ships. It's really the primary raider light attack ship that the Klingons will utilize in this period. Now, judging from the aesthetic, it actually looks a bit newer and modern. It's got a lot more in common with things such as like the D5. In terms of where it stacks up in overall matchups, directly inferior one-on-one to anything in the 22nd century, pretty much. Certainly it's inferior to the Krios corvette and to the Orion interceptor. It's quite a weak ship, but that's why it's reliant on those wolfpack tactics, and it's the building block of a lot of very aggressive Klingon raiding forces. Now, by contrast, our next ship is actually more of a defensively minded ship, and we don't see it much. This is the Gunboat, or you might know it as Goroth's ship, or the Klingon transport. Now, this is quite a compact and robust ship. It's probably quite well armoured. It's certainly very much more defensively minded. This is probably more intended for system defence rather than any kind of aggressive undertaking. In terms of its size, it's about 82 meters long. I scaled it using it has the same sensor array on the back as the Raptor class, so I scaled it from that. It is armed with 6 disruptor cannons, no discernible torpedo launcher. That recess on the front of the hull is more likely a deflector dish than it is a torpedo launcher. It doesn't have a big enough aperture to fire a torpedo from it because of the slope. In terms of its capabilities, it is very much a defensive, short-range craft. It's going to be about superior to a Krios corvette because it's got 6 disruptors to the corvette's 2 particle cannons, although the corvette does have warhead launchers. But that's roughly its level. It's still very much inferior to the Orion interceptor. Again, it's a defensive ship. It's going to operate in little pods and is going to be supported oftentimes by either some kind of rudimentary fortification or larger cruisers. And it won't really be undertaking long-range independent missions by itself. It's going to very much stay within the borders of the Empire. Now, getting into a more aggressive expeditionary ship is the Bird of Prey. Now, unlike the Klingon Bird of Prey that we will see in the 23rd and 24th century, this occupies a very different niche in this period. This is a heavy frigate. This is the Klingon's primary do-everything, general-purpose starship. Now, it's primarily a gunship, again, although it does have a torpedo launcher. It's mainly reliant on its disruptor loadout. It has 6 disruptor cannons, 2 in the front on the head section, 2 on an underbelly turret, and 2 in the wings. It is their primary long-range general-purpose frigate that's going to go out and strike targets and harass enemy shipping and also serve as escort and support for larger ships. It really is one of the key building blocks of the Klingon fleet in this period. In terms of its capability, from what we see on the show, I'm very confident in putting it above the Orion interceptor in terms of power, but below that of the Orion barge, and needless to say, it's above Krios corvette, but still below that of a battlecruiser. It's the lowest form of deep space, long-range starship. It's the weakest of them, but it is the most ubiquitous. Now, going up to a light cruiser category is the Klingon Raptor class. I know it's referenced as a scout, But if you look at it for what it is in this period, in terms of its size, it is a light cruiser by every metric. Now, the model is not particularly detailed, so it's difficult to pick out armaments. My guess would be around 4 to 6 disruptor cannons across the ship's surface. There is no prow torpedo launcher, but there is a rear torpedo launcher, so perhaps that's more of a defensive system, or it's used specifically for like mine laying and other kind of specialist tasks. The Raptor, in terms of its capability, is very much a sort of a raider leader. It would be leading packs of raiders and birds of prey in strikes into enemy space, again attacking enemy shipping. It's capable of dealing with the majority of other kinds of sort of light patrol ships. It's going to be capable of dealing with that. To deal with a Raptor, you need to start bringing in a capital grade ship, really. The other option is that because of its nacelle configuration, which is unusually upright, it's quite fast for its size, able to cruise at high speed. It's perhaps also a very good aggressive reconnaissance ship that can get in and get out and get a good idea of what the enemy is capable of, while also being able to defend itself. In terms of its capability, it's probably around equal to an NX class, possibly a little bit weaker. I think it would perhaps depend on the circumstance, probably about equal to an Orion barge. It would depend on the circumstances, but that's sort of the kind of power level it's at, and probably just slightly outmatched by a good Krios battlecruiser. Maybe not so much one of the older ones used by the minor houses. Certainly it is outmatched by a Sovereign Guard battlecruiser. Now we're getting into the Klingons' capital ships. These are of course the most iconic Klingon ships, but in this period they really make up a minority of the fleet and are quite rare to see. And these are of course the Klingon battlecruisers. And they're not as widespread and prolific as they will become in the 23rd century, where the Klingon fleet becomes a fleet of battlecruisers. So the first one to talk about is the Klingon D4, which has a size of about 175 meters. This is according to the Axanar scale, which I'm inclined to agree with in places, although I don't think I agree with it in terms of the size of the D5. I'll probably do a whole video where I go into more detail about the D4, and obviously its production history, because otherwise I'll go on a tangent here. But the D4 is most certainly a torpedo cruiser. That is the most kind of distinguishing element of the D4, is that it's got that big, long-range, high-powered torpedo launcher on the command hull. It's got that big kind of Katinga-style torpedo launcher on the front. Then, of course, it's got the rear launcher. Again, similar high-power, long-range torpedo launcher. And looking at the wings, which have the shoulder sort of bulk out a little bit, it's quite possible that those are also some kind of ordnance launchers or even torpedo launchers in the wings, because those are quite bulked out wings. Perhaps if the model was able to be refined further, they would have added that detail. Who knows? It may have some disruptors for defense, but I imagine it's mostly reliant on its torpedo complement and its speed to survive. I imagine that the D4 is going to hang at the edge of the battle space and just rain in long-range torpedo fire from a safe distance, and if anyone tries to close it down, it's got enough speed to get out the way. And that's really where the D4 excels, is in that long-range skirmishing with torpedoes, sort of sniping with torpedoes. Now, in terms of, again, its matchup, I would place it as superior to the NX-01 and probably superior to the Krios Battlecruiser. Now, if the Krios Battlecruiser ever got in range with its particle cannons, the D4 might be in trouble, but because of the speed of the D4, it's very unlikely that could ever happen. So the D4 is certainly firmly has an advantage over a lot of its enemies that it would encounter just purely through the long-range capabilities of its torpedo launchers. Now that brings us to the biggest and most powerful Klingon ship of this period. That is the D5 Battlecruiser. The D5 is a gunship. Having reviewed the on-screen evidence, I don't think it even has a torpedo launcher. Looking at the model and the on-screen evidence, I'm very confident in that. Now you might say, effects guys screwing up, but like I say, because I've worked out this logic of the Klingons having torpedo ships and gunships in this period, I think it's nice that there's that distinction. So, the D5 is about 200 meters long. Varies depending on who you ask, but I would settle on about 200 meters long. It is armed with one heavy disruptor in the nose section, on the underside where you would think a torpedo launcher would be, but every time we see it fire, it's firing disruptor bolts. It then has on the belly a twin disruptor turret, again similar to that we see on the Bird of Prey, and we also see it fire a number of light disruptors across its hull. I would imagine in total there are about 4 light disruptors across the ship's surface. It has no rear torpedo launcher. I did look on the model. What is at the rear of that ship is a shuttle bay. So I'm very confident in saying that it has no torpedo launcher and it is just purely a disruptor ship. But taking into account the power of both the heavy disruptor on the front and the turreted disruptor on the underside, that's a very potent armament. And also given that this is a battle cruiser and it has a lot of speed and agility, it's going to be very able to keep its targets in its sights and just pour on disruptor fire. So it might very well be supported by a D4, which would be then at long range, pouring on the torpedo fire while it pours on the disruptor fire. So you can see there is an element of cooperation designed for these ships. In terms of its capabilities, it is most certainly superior to the NX-01. The only time we see the NX-01 defeat this battlecruiser is through Duras, who's an idiot, shenanigans with the grappler, and when we say defeat, it ripped off a bit of the engine. It didn't actually disable the Klingon battlecruiser. And then when we see it in Divergence, the Klingon battlecruiser is still in the fight by the end. The NX-01 doesn't really manage to put a dent in it. So I am fairly certain that the D5 is superior to the NX-01, and certainly therefore by extension superior to a Kriosian battlecruiser. What it is not superior to is a Kriosian battleship, which as previously discussed, is an absolute monster. But that's a rough approximation of the capabilities of all these different ships. So in terms of the doctrine, I think you've kind of seen it through the kind of delineation between gunships and torpedo ships. There is very much an emphasis on pack tactics, on working together as a pack, generally as a house, because that's generally how these fleets are put together to bring down larger targets. Aside from that, Klingons don't have a coherent doctrine in this period. What they have is a series of tactics that will vary from individual houses, a bit like the differences in cultures between killer whale pods. They all have their own ways of hunting and bringing down prey. Another thing to bear in mind is that the Klingons put a lot of emphasis still on the boarding action, and a lot of these ships are capable of facilitating that. And so really, when it comes down to it, altogether, the Klingon fleet is quite a irregular force. It's really to be put together in, there's no set doctrine or composition of units. It's just whatever you happen to have at the time and are able to bring together for a battle. But what we do see, like I say, is a real preference here for specialization and an operation in small pods of starships. The Klingon fleet of this period is quite capable, certainly as a defensive and raiding force. But that's only on a small scale. Just imagine if all this firepower was brought together under coherent leadership. No one would be safe. Thank you guys for watching. This will probably be the last fundraising video I'll do. Not because I've sort of given up on it or anything, just because we're now getting to the point where I'd have to talk about the fall of Krios, and I'd actually like to devote more time to that and more detail to that than just this kind of off-the-cuff discussion video. I'd like to make a properly documentary style thing out of it. So this is probably going to be the end for now, but keep an eye out. Rise of the Empire, that's probably what I'm going to call the series, and the Fall of Krios will be the second episode. So watch this space, because I will follow up on this, and I will see you guys in the next video. Thank you so very much.